From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
The U.S. says Russia and Ukraine agree to a ceasefire in the Black Sea, even as the Kremlin says a deal depends on preconditions, including sanctions relief. We'll discuss with former Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman.
President Trump standing by his national security advisor after a journalist was inadvertently sent war plans via the Signal text app. While the president's top two intelligence officials testified today on Capitol Hill. We'll talk this out with Democratic Congressman Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, who serves on the House Intelligence Committee.
And Republican congressional leaders meet with President Trump's economic team on reconciliation, while rank and file members meet with Bridgewater's Ray Dalio about debt and deficits. Garrett Watson from the Tax Foundation will have insights straight ahead.
Thanks for being with us on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lyons. Before attending a key tax meeting at the White House today with top Republican lawmakers, House Speaker Mike Johnson said this about working with his colleagues in the Senate.
There's no daylight between House and Senate Republicans. We are one team. I speak with Leader Thune about this constantly, and with individual members of the Senate over there. We're all united on the mission, and there's been different ideas about how to complete the mission, but I think it's all coming together now. This week will be pivotal.
Joining us now with more is Bloomberg's Megan Scully. So, Megan, if this week will be pivotal, what exactly has to pivot this week in terms of getting the Senate and the House on the same page?
I don't know that we're going to get them on the same page this week. Contrary to what the speaker said, there is daylight between the two chambers, particularly on the details. And as we know, covering these things on Capitol Hill, the details is where we have problems generally in these negotiations. So, things like whether or not to include the debt ceiling, which all leaders seem to be in agreement about at this point, but it's whether they can get it through the Senate with any kind of language attached regarding the debt ceiling. There's also, exactly how to count the tax cuts and whether to grandfather in the Trump tax cuts and then not count it. All that funny math that they've been talking about doing to try to make it look like the tax cuts aren't costing the government money.
Well, to that end, Ray Dalio made a visit to speak with Republican lawmakers today. We spoke with one of them on the early edition of Balance of Power. The message, of course, when it comes to debt and deficits, not necessarily in line with what the administration wants to do. As he said, we're at a precarious time in what I call the big cycle, where there's a confluence of major forces playing out in a way similar to many times in history. Ray Dalio, known for his research in this area. But the question that it seems to me is coming from Capitol Hill, at least among Republicans, is just how much to cut, how big to go.
Well, and how to do it, right? So, today, Ray Dalio said that, budget deficits should essentially be cut in half, and that and even Republicans who were in the meeting who all said, this was a great meeting. One called him grandfatherly in terms of the advice he was giving to them. But they even acknowledged that their own plan, which would add trillions of dollars to the debt, that it would not adhere to the 3% of GDP that Ray Dalio laid out. They said this is something that would take years to get to. But we've seen with Elon Musk, for instance, wanting to really slash and burn the federal government and the problems that he's encountering, both in terms of processes and politics.
Well, Bloomberg's Megan Scully, we thank you very much for the time here on Balance of Power as we add the voice of Garrett Watson, Director of Policy Analysis at the Tax Foundation. With the Trump tax cuts in mind, Garrett, it's great to have you with us. The question is to extend or to make permanent, and the price tag is going to be pretty different. Which one will they arrive at?
So there's a key tension right now between the desire to keep the costs contained under extending the tax cuts and to create stability or permanence for taxpayers. We're seeing, of course, at the end of the year, a big cliff, a big change in taxes for most American households. And they have a choice to potentially temporarily extend these tax cuts. That'll make things cheaper, But coming out the trade-off that these households will deal with, once again, a potential tax cliff in the future, a potential tax hike, and Congress will have to do this exercise all over again. So there's going to be a discussion about what elements of that major tax cut in 2017 to make permanent or extend as long as possible, and what elements should be deprioritized. And that goes right back to that central question you were just talking about, which is what is the tolerance for increasing debt and what is the tolerance for other types of offsets? And that's what they have to deal with right now.
Well, and one of the arguments the administration is making on behalf of keeping taxes low is that it juices growth and that we can in part grow our way out of it. And I do wonder if what we're fundamentally talking about here is largely maintaining the status quo as it exists now with the added things of no tax on tips or Social Security. How stimulative will this actually be if there is an extension?
So I think that's a key question. And at Tax Foundation, we have found there would be some positive growth for making these tax cuts permanent. And it would reduce the cost some by about 15%. But we're talking about 15% of a nearly $5 trillion tax cut. So there's still a sizable amount here that would need to be covered through other tax changes, spending cuts, or increasing the deficit. And that's before we get to these other types of ideas that the president and Congress are looking at, such as making no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime pay, among other ideas. So they'll have to think about what are the major provisions to make permanent that are pro-growth and which ones folks will find benefit from. And I think that's another key point, which is a lot of folks are going to view this tax cut extension as an extension of the status quo. So adding additional tax cuts helps them see progress there in terms of lowering their tax bill. But they'll have to make the math work if they don't want to increase the deficit too much and get further away from what Ray Dalio has been warning them about.
Well, that's right. And with Ray Dalio in mind, I wonder what the Tax Foundation makes of the DOGE specific to this process and the ability for lawmakers to connect the dots between some of the savings that has in some cases been overstated by the DOGE to actually codify that in legislation, to make that part of the scoring in this legislation. Can they do it?
So a couple of things here. One, of course, is there's a key question of how much DOGE can cut or what those findings look like to get that finalized so everyone's on the same page of what the size and compositions of those cuts are. And then can they get those cuts into a rescission package? We've seen several members of Congress, including in the Senate especially, saying that they want to see a rescission package. Such a rescission package has failed in prior years narrowly in Congress. And so that would be the uphill battle, is getting a vote. The one benefit of that is then they can formally take that savings and apply it against the cost of the tax cuts. And that would be a positive, and that would, of course, codify and potentially make more permanent a lot of the things that DOGE is looking at. The question is, how do they get from where they are now to that rescission package? Is there enough space and time to actually do that in what is a pretty aggressive timetable?
Well, yeah, the timetable very much a question as we consider whether or not this can actually be done before Memorial Day, or if the debt ceiling is to be included, whenever the debt ceiling ex-date is actually going to be. As we consider the kind of tax side of the equation and how that fits into the revenue picture, what role realistically, Garrett, will tariff revenue play as we await this Liberation Day next week that the president keeps talking about, April 2nd?
So with tariffs, the big trend, of course, is that it's been a White House-led project. The president is very passionate about this. And of course, the House and Senate leadership amongst Republicans has been supportive, but there hasn't been that additional move to codify through legislation these tariffs. And of course, there's still a lot of uncertainty in the business community and in the policy community on what the direction of those tariffs and the size of those tariffs may look like. So that, of course, has a big impact on potential revenue if they are removed in the near future. That, of course, doesn't bring in nearly as much. And there may not be sufficient support or votes in Congress to actually make them into law, and in this case, most relevantly, to score it formally against the tax cuts. It's going to be potentially a rhetorical device more so that, hey, look at this tariff revenue that the White House is bringing in. That should be part of the consideration. But of course, that does require a long-term stability for what that tariff regime may look like. We may know more by April 2nd what that might end up looking like and how much revenue we can look at there, and what the economic damage may be, which also should be factored in.
You're worried about April 15th, Garrett? We hear so much about DOGE cuts at the IRS. It's easier to get the phone answer to Social Security these days. What's it going to mean for revenues?
So there was, of course, that warning that was coming through this weekend that we may see depressed revenues upwards of 10% when you look at the April 15th revenue collections. One ambiguity is it's still not entirely clear to what extent those warning signs are flashing internally at the IRS. They have some detailed metrics that they look at there. But the one consideration here for Congress is if that turns out to be true, the X date may end up sooner rather than later. We might be looking at a July or August timeframe, or maybe even sooner if that short-term revenue is depressed. And that, of course, significantly complicates the timing of this package, because if the debt limit were to ride onto it, they need to get the rest of the details finished to get that passed through Congress. And so that does complicate the situation for Republicans in Congress. And hopefully by Wednesday, we'll get the CBO's estimate on this and we get a little more of a picture.
Yep, that's supposed to hit at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Garrett Watson, Director of Policy Analysis at the Tax Foundation, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, President Trump defends his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, after he inadvertently included the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic in a Signal group chat about plans for military strikes in Yemen. We'll get reaction to this security breach from a member of the House Intelligence Committee. Democratic Congressman Krishnamoorthi of Illinois joins next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We are looking into and reviewing how the heck he got into this room as Director Radcliffe testified today. His first day on the job, he was introduced to this app on his government systems at the CIA and at the State Department.
I don't know anything about Signal. I wasn't involved in this, but I just heard about it. And I hear it's used by a lot of groups. It's used by the media a lot. It's used by a lot of the military, and I think successfully, but sometimes somebody can get onto those things. That's one of the prices you pay when you're not sitting in the Situation Room.
President Trump and his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, at the White House today, responding to questions over how a journalist ended up in a Signal group chat about plans for military strikes in Yemen. According to that reporter, Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic, Waltz is the official who inadvertently added him to the chat. Joining us now with more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Democratic Congressman Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, member of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, we also heard from National Security Advisor Mike Waltz today that this is really just a media hoax. He and the president seem to be suggesting no harm, no foul here. How do you see it?
No, I totally disagree. I think that this is one of those situations where we're endangering national security by using an unauthorized platform to disclose information of a highly, highly sensitive nature. And then secondly, when you don't take accountability for it, basically what happens is it's likely to happen again. This mistake, this error, this gross negligence, whatever, this recklessness, whatever you want to call it, is likely to happen again. And this unauthorized information the next time could be disclosed in such a manner that could lead to the loss of American lives or worse. And so I think that this response that Donald Trump and others have taken is really inappropriate, to say the least.
This isn't about the app at all, is it, Congressman? I realize Washington loves Signal. If you weren't aware of that before now, you certainly are. It's used by politicians, by journalists, according to Donald Trump, the military. This is about the way the app is used, and in this case by a government official sending war plans over the platform. Do we need to be clear about that? We're not going to start deleting Signal here. It's about the way that this is used and the responsibility of those who are on it.
Correct. I think that the app has some known vulnerabilities that, for instance, the Russians and others are trying to take advantage of. And so that is why, in part, it is not an appropriate platform to transmit classified information or information of a highly sensitive nature, such as attack plans or war plans. And so a junior officer, should he or she have done exactly what happened as detailed in this Atlantic article, would have been court-martialed or worse. And I actually received a text message today from a mom of a sailor who said the same thing. And so I hope that as people, whether they're in the military or otherwise, are watching, that there's accountability, there's an investigation, because we need to know the extent of these types of chats or these signal conversations happening in other contexts that might be even more risky than what we saw here. And so we need to get to the bottom of this.
Well, on the subject of investigations, Congressman, we've already had an indication from the Senate Armed Services Committee Chair Roger Wicker that he'd like to look into this. No such indication from Senator Tom Cotton, who chairs the Intel Committee, during today's hearing. Have you heard anything from the leadership of the intelligence panel in the House about this? Will this be pursued?
I have not. Certainly on our side, we had a long discussion and meeting about this in a classified space, the SCIF. And I'm sure that this is going to come up in our questioning of witnesses tomorrow, both in the open session as well as the closed session. I should just say one last note about this, which is that usually the Inspector General for the DOD or other branches would basically collaborate in investigating. As you know, Donald Trump has fired a lot of these people, and that's one of the reasons why we are so concerned when there isn't a third-party, independent, objective investigator on hand to be able to do these things. All that being said, we need to do our job in Congress in our oversight role, and that's what I intend to do tomorrow.
I want to bring our viewers and listeners inside a hearing today, Senate Intelligence Committee hearing that we've talked about. This is on the Senate side. To get a sense of this conversation, Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, the ranking member on the committee, grilling the CIA director in this case, John Ratcliffe, on his use of signal. Listen.
Director Ratcliffe, were you on the group chat?
Senator, I was on a signal messaging group.
So you were the John Ratcliffe on that chat?
I was.
Thank you.
Those were procedures that were implemented.
Director Ratcliffe?
My staff implemented those processes, followed those processes, complied with those processes, and finally, just please, so my communications, to be clear, in a signal message group were entirely permissible and lawful and did not include classified information.
Well, we will make that determination.
We'll see if that determination is made, Congressman, from your perch on the House Intel Committee. Is that true? If no classified information was disseminated, was there anything wrong here, legally speaking? And if there was something wrong, who needs to be fired?
I disagree with the notion that somehow this was completely a legitimate group chat with regard to these war plans, these attack plans. Even if Pete Hegseth or someone didn't have time to stamp the information top secret, it's clear that it was of a highly, highly sensitive nature and should not have been disclosed. Certainly, in the hands of an adversary or the hands of the Houthis, it could have endangered American lives. And so that is why we are concerned. Just broadening the scope a little bit, I'm just very concerned about the nonchalant way with which they are answering these questions from the standpoint of, how they are handling data. How are they handling information of a highly sensitive nature? The same thing is happening with DOGE and Elon Musk. My constituents are absolutely livid right now that the Trump administration is treating that information as carelessly as they are. Here, with attack plans and war plans, lives could be lost. American lives are in danger.
Congressman, we just have a minute left, but as you talk about data security, that obviously was one of the concerns when it comes to TikTok and the ban that could kick in here in the U.S. next Saturday if a deal is not reached. From your perch as the ranking member on the China Select Committee, has the administration read you in to efforts to avert that ban?
Yeah, through our staff, we are now aware of what is kind of transpiring between the parties to some degree, although I don't think that anything has been finalized. All that being said, I hope that a divestiture is completed. At least the initial meaningful steps are completed, and I hope that we're able to get the CCP out of our data. That's very important.
It's good to have you back, Congressman. Roger Krishnamoorthi, Democrat of Illinois, we thank you. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you.
if you kind of evaluate the situation right now, the risk of the economy accelerating with all sorts of things hanging over the economy is pretty small. On the other hand, there's a real possibility that we slow down.
Krishnamoorthi, Chief Investment Officer at Lafayette College, this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance, discussing the possibility of an economic slowdown, with data released today showing U.S. consumer confidence falling in March to the lowest level in 4 years due to concerns over higher prices and the economic outlook amid the Trump administration's escalating tariffs. With us now for the details and to look ahead a bit is Stuart Paul, Bloomberg Economics. Stuart, it's great to have you back. Are we to believe then that if Donald Trump just pulled all the tariffs off the table, consumer confidence would go back up?
I think that pulling the tariffs off the table would result in a rebound in consumer confidence. I think that policy uncertainty, which is a major factor here in consumer confidence, would wane. I think that what's really going on is that consumers are looking at these proposed tariff policies, these tariff threats, really, and they're baking them into their inflation expectations. Relative to where we were at the end of 2024, consumers reported today that their year-ahead inflation expectations were 1.1 percentage points higher. When you look at the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, they're all the consumers, the respondents, are referring to tariffs, even if they're not asked specifically about tariffs. So I do think you're right. Pulling back those tariff threats would result in a bit of a rebound here in sentiment.
Well, as you mentioned, you missed, Stuart. It did seem that the chair of the Fed, Jay Powell, in the news conference last week was playing down the inflation expectations of that reading. At what point is there a mass quantity of data that tells the Fed it actually needs to pay attention?
The Fed's in a tricky position because it needs to maintain this sense that it can restore inflation back to the 2% target. So it's always going to play down inflation expectations that run against its narrative. I think that when the Fed looks at the survey data, though, it has to acknowledge one thing in particular, which is that consumers are not only revising up their inflation expectations, they're also adjusting their purchase plans. They're pulling forward their purchases and their expected purchases, their planned purchases of big consumer durable goods, things that have a lot of imported parts. And when you have that dynamic where you have high expected prices in the future, and so you try to get ahead of that by increasing your willingness to purchase those goods today, you actually beget the inflation that you are anticipating as a consumer. The Fed knows this, and when the Fed sees the purchase plans in today's report, they have to get a little bit concerned.
Yeah. All right, Stuart Paul of Bloomberg Economics, thank you for joining us. And still ahead, the U.S. announces that Russia and Ukraine have agreed to a ceasefire in the Black Sea. We'll have more with Wendy Sherman, former Deputy Secretary of State, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
So we've made a lot of progress on two fronts, on both sections that we call them sections, but they're much more than that, Russia, Ukraine, and also the Middle East, and we'll see what happens. We're in deep discussions with Russia and Ukraine, and I would say it's going well. Some very, very big talks are going and detailed talks are going on right now on both fronts.
President Trump speaking from the White House earlier today after the U.S. said Russia and Ukraine agreed to a ceasefire in the Black Sea during separate talks in Saudi Arabia this week. But the Kremlin says its involvement would depend on a series of preconditions, including sanctions relief. And joining us now with the latest here on Bloomberg TV and radio is our colleague Natalia Drozdiak, here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Natalia, we hear in the aftermath of the U.S. releasing these two separate statements from President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, who says this partial ceasefire is going to begin immediately. Russia then comes out and says there has to be more discussions. There's also conditions at play here. So are we actually aligned on the timeline?
Well, this is the second time now that we're seeing two different readouts between the U.S. and Russia, and it just underscores how difficult it's going to be to get a full ceasefire here, and it just also highlights how Russia might be playing for time and trying to seek extra concessions in this in these discussions.
So who's running this? You see the headline, U.S. says that we have an agreement, then Russia changes the story. Is Russia actually driving these negotiations?
Well, I think it's a bit more nuanced in that, I mean, we heard Trump say they are looking at these Russian demands, but it's clear that this was not something that was actually agreed to today. Okay. And Russia's making it sound like this maritime ceasefire will only happen once all those sanctions are lifted. Right. Now, it's important to remember that when it comes to sanctions, the U.S. would also need EU allies on board there. So it's not something that the U.S. could do very easily. And, you know, the other important factor to remember is in terms of the Black Sea, any ceasefire there would actually benefit Russia because we've seen the Ukrainians have managed to successfully push out the Russian forces there over the last year. So that's something else to keep in mind here. They're making concessions on something that actually benefits them.
Well, we've heard the very same about the energy infrastructure ceasefire as well, that actually has benefits for Russia, too. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky posted on X a short time ago saying that how Russia behaves in the coming days will reveal a lot. He went on to say results are needed. We do not trust them. And frankly, the world doesn't trust Russia. Is the only actor that seems to be buying what the Kremlin is currently selling the Trump administration?
I think, you know, with the Trump administration, they've made clear, and Witkoff being one of the main negotiators, you know, they don't want to disparage the Russians in public because they want to be seen as neutral negotiators. But at the same time, they have made comments that have worried Ukrainians and European officials that really seem to be kind of taking and buying the Russian talking points. So the question now going forward will be, you know, at what point does Trump's patience run out with these tactics? Mm-hmm.
It's great to have you back at the table, Natalia. Bloomberg's Natalia Drozdiak with us here on Balance of Power as we now turn to Wendy Sherman, the former Deputy Secretary of State under the Biden administration, now Joint Senior Fellow with the Belfer Center and Center for Public Leadership at Harvard University. It's great to have you back. Can you help us read between the lines here and understand what is real? Obviously, we have a certain line from the U.S. indicating that there's a partial ceasefire in place. Russia, as we just discussed, is making us think otherwise. Is the truth somewhere in the middle?
Well, I think Natalia delivered a really good report. I think that the White House wants people to feel that there's forward progress. But as she rightly reported, the Russians said only if you lift sanctions. And already, in my view, the Trump administration has given Russia way too much. Already said that we believe that Ukraine should never become part of NATO, that there will have to be territorial concessions, that there can be business opportunities for Russia. So this kind of negotiations where you give everything up front, I think most of business leaders will say that's really not the best way to do things if you're trying to cut a deal and try to move things forward. When it comes to peace, it's even more important to be very thoughtful about what you're doing. So I think what's happened here is there are parallel talks, and I understand why they're doing that. It's not yet time where the Ukrainians and the Russians really want to be face to face, though I think Zelensky would take that on. But at the same time, people hear different things. The White House is trying to push the parties forward, push Russia forward, but Russia, I believe, is taking all the time they can to continue to prosecute this war, try to get more territory, and feel like the U.S. is really in their corner and have been pretty tough on Zelensky and on Ukraine. Nonetheless, it's good there are talks. I hope we get to these sectional ceasefires, as the president is calling them, but I don't think we are there yet.
Well, as you characterize the nature of what Russia is getting from the U.S. here, it does sound similar to what Mara Rudman, now of the University of Virginia's Miller Center, but a former U.S. diplomat herself, told us on the early edition of Balance of Power today. This was how she phrased it.
The Russians believe, at least, that they are calling the shots here and that they say jump and the United States says how high and then translates that to the Ukrainians. So they're trying to get more from a deal. The question is whether they said that in the room to Steve Witkoff and others, or whether they're now saying it after the fact.
And when we consider what Russia is trying to get here, if it is indeed sanctions relief, given how little it seems the sanctions in place have actually altered Russia's behavior in terms of its continued efforts in this war, its war machine still fully functional. Why should we believe that the relief of some sanctions is actually going to mean that Russia makes other concessions when it comes to a ceasefire deal?
Kayleigh, I think you make exactly the right point. I think they will want more and more. And as Natalia pointed out, the United States has very little trade with Russia. The real trading partner is Europe in the past. We know that when it comes to oil and gas as well in the past. And so this is about whether the Europeans will lift sanctions. And I don't think the Europeans feel like they are in this negotiation in an appropriate way. And we can't negotiate away their rights, their interests. So this is also more of a unilateralism that says that our allies are not important, when in fact I believe our allies are essential to reaching this deal, because we want them to provide the security for Ukraine when there is a full-on ceasefire and peace agreement. And if they're not there at the takeoff of these negotiations, it's hard to see how they're going to really be there with any deal that we might cut. The other point I want to make is Steve Witkoff clearly is a successful businessman, has done a lot of deals, but even though he's trying to keep Russia at the table, his parroting in other interviews he's held, the Russian line, makes me really question whether he's naive about what is going on. The fact that he was in Russia when this crazy signals, dangerous signals call happened that you discussed with the congressman in the prior segment, just goes to show that we're not really thinking through our security in everything that we're doing in these negotiations with Russia, in operational security with Witkoff being on a signals channel while he's in Russia. I'm sure the Russians are very happy to have overheard that conversation. It's very hard to have security when you're in Moscow. Most of us leave our phones behind if you travel to Russia, just like we leave our phones behind and they use burner phones if we go to China. I know that all of the business leaders that listen to Bloomberg understand quite well. All their security people tell them, do not bring your computer, do not bring your phone into these countries because they're not secure.
So do you think the Russians got a look at this phone that you're describing here, that Steve Witkoff brought to Moscow, that actually had his private phone with the Signal app? And Wendy Sherman, have you ever sent sensitive information to a journalist on Signal?
No. You know, Joe, this was an extraordinary intelligence brief and breach, sorry. It was a brief and it was a breach, both. And I've never seen anything like it. As the congressman said, this put our troops' lives at risk. I understand there was even a CIA agent who was named, who was undercover in that conversation. I believe that when any principals committee meets, which is what this was, it was a principals committee meeting where very, very critical decisions are made. They should be done in a SCIF, in a secure environment, with the highest security level. And that didn't happen here.
All right, Wendy, it was so great to have you and really appreciate you joining us this evening. Wendy Sherman, former Deputy Secretary of State. Thank you. Coming up, we'll have more on the fallout from that Signal group chat and security breach we were just discussing. We'll get the take from our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
There was no classified material that was shared in that.
So then if there was no classified material, share it with the committee. You can't have it both ways. These are important jobs. This is our national security. Director Patel, has the FBI launched any investigation of this?
Senator, I was just briefed about it late last night, this morning. I don't have an update.
I would like to get an answer by the end of the day.
Did this conversation at some point include information on weapons packages, targets, or timing?
Not that I'm aware of, Director Gabbard. Same question.
Same answer, and defer to the Department of Defense on that question.
A discussion by senior U.S. officials on the timing and risks of a proposed military campaign and disagreements between the president and the vice president about U.S. plans and intentions would be of obvious interest to foreign intelligence services, would it not?
Yes.
What you're saying doesn't make sense on the face of it.
Just some of the exchanges between the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, FBI Director Kash Patel, and Democratic senators during a pre-scheduled hearing today, just one day after the publication of a bombshell story by The Atlantic's editor-in-chief, who was inadvertently added to a Signal group chat of administration officials, including two of which you just heard from, discussing plans to strike Yemen. And joining us now with their reaction is this evening's political panel. Roger Fisk, former aide to President Barack Obama and Democratic strategist, alongside Republican strategist Lisa Kumusa-Miller, host of the Friday Reporter podcast. Welcome to you both. Nice to have you here on Bloomberg TV and radio, as always. You both will get to take a bite out of this apple. Lisa, we've heard now from Tulsi Gabbard, from John Ratcliffe, and from Mike Waltz, who was the one who created this group chat at the White House today, who suggested this is all just a media hoax, despite the National Security Council confirming the authenticity of the chat group. Is the White House messaging this administration messaging this the right way?
The one thing that I see is a gigantic disadvantage to the actual pragmatic people in Washington, D.C. and all across the globe that know that what happened was a terrible breach of security, is that on the Hill today, the only questions that were pointed were from Democrats. And so for that reason alone, the optics of this coming from the White House will be supported by that, even though the person that called it a hoax is the man who generated the problem in the first place.
So are we embracing this as an administration? Are we denying it? I'm having a little bit of trouble because the White House did acknowledge that this group chat took place. But again, we're hearing Mike Waltz use words like hoax and a White House going out of its way to denigrate the journalist involved here, who, by the way, voluntarily left that chat and did not publish any of the sensitive information that was shared.
Right. First off, thank you so much for having me, and I love being here with Lisa. In his confirmation hearings, Secretary Hegseth said accountability is back, and I guess that's way back or something. And the other thing is, you know, Jeffrey Goldberg has been around for a little while, and he has already said he has not released everything. Yeah. So as you see some of these people say this, you know, this specific category of things wasn't discussed or anything, he could very well be sitting on things that he's specifically holding to release in another day or two to add an additional level of, frankly, incompetence and disingenuousness around things. This is all information that is gathered by sources and methods that are actual human beings. The CIA resource that was revealed in that chain could be working at a consulting firm or an export-import firm or something somewhere, and decades of preparation and training could just go out the window because they've been revealed in this civilian application that is not secure in any way, shape, or form. And the way they portrayed the process, that this was handed over to them and that this is all above board, it's front to back. It's not the reflection of a team that takes their responsibilities to national security seriously.
Well, so then it becomes a question of the consequences. Even if more is to be released, if the committees in the House and Senate that are charged with overseeing it, be it armed services or intelligence, launch investigations into it, what does it matter if President Trump himself doesn't want a head to roll over this, Lisa?
It's really going to be difficult to watch because it is going to be the kind of thing that is going to become more of a just a political football and a circus, as opposed to the very serious nature of what has happened here. And that's precisely right. It's the one thing I think that as an adult, myself as an adult, I look around and I wonder who in the world is in charge. And it doesn't feel like anyone serious is in charge right now. And that is frightening.
We heard from President Trump a couple of times on this. He took a first swing last evening, denigrated The Atlantic as a publication. He said he hadn't read the story yet. He was well read in by the time a cabinet meeting was held today. And then later, when he interfaced with reporters, listen to this. He was meeting with U.S. ambassadors and was asked about the fallout over the Signal chat.
There was no classified information, as I understand it. They used a app, if you want to call it an app, that a lot of people use, a lot of people in government use, a lot of people in the media use.
So, Roger, let's say that this was all fine. Signal's a good place to share sensitive information. You spent time working for the Obama White House. You had a top security clearance, and you traveled to other countries. You didn't bring your personal phone for a reason. What is that? Because we know Steve Witkoff had Signal on his phone in Moscow.
Yeah, that is stunning to me. Just as the president insisted on holding on to his Android phone in his first administration, your question to Elise, I think, is real, or rather, Kaylee's to Lisa, is about accountability. There will be accountability. The accountability will come in the market forces of the intelligence communities of our 25 major industrialized allies around the world, who are going to look at the United States, and when they come across actionable intelligence specifically relevant to Russia or Iran or anything like that, they're going to stop and they're going to say, do we really want to share that with the United States? And if people don't think that that translates into an increased threat to our men and women that are serving abroad, both in a clandestine context and in a military context, their eyes are not open. This is deadly, deadly serious.
Well, so when we consider those allies that we share intelligence with, some of them were spoken about not too kindly in this group chat as well, as they were considering the implications of targeting the Houthis and how, in the minds at least of the vice president, as well as Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, it would benefit Europe more, and they're freeloaders. Lisa, how are our allies reading this Atlantic article?
Well, our allies are already a little bit, I mean, Roger's point could not be more on. It is, the allies already are questioning what in the world is happening here in the U.S., but to see all of that in print, it just further breaks up that connection and that important ally that we have with all of Europe.
In administrations past, it might be considered traditional for everyone involved here to submit a resignation letter today and leave it up to the boss as to whether to accept any of them. Maybe he wouldn't take any. Do you think that happened this time?
No, I do not. I think that this is a blatant act of arrogance, and that is precisely what has happened here.
Okay, so when we consider whether it's going to happen again, Roger, the president also indicated today maybe they'll use Signal in the future. Maybe sometimes you can't get everyone in the Situation Room, and it's the best means of communication.
I referenced Secretary Hegseth's confirmation hearings. Imagine if you're just a private or you're a Marine or a merchant Marine or in the Coast Guard or anything else, and if you conducted anything approaching official business on a civilian application like this, you would at least be reprimanded, quite possibly criminally prosecuted. And the idea that the fact that they want to say that this is not a secure conversation or that secure information, the very definition of this constellation of individuals having a conversation is by definition classified. The Secretary of State, the DNI, on and on. No matter what they're talking about, having those people in a group. And so it sends for an organization, a political movement that's all about dismantling the elites, it's sending a very clear signal to the rank and file of the military and the civilian forces of the government that says, we can do this, but you can't.
Do either of you think anyone gets fired here, Roger?
The president is a master of optics, and I think firing would be to admit a weakness, and he's incapable of that.
Fired?
I think Roger's right. I think that whoever goes, if they go, it will look as if they're going on their own accord, and I don't expect that to happen.
You've heard it from Lisa Camuso-Miller and Roger Fisk. A great panel, great conversation. Thank you both. Coming up, leaders of PBS and NPR set to testify before the House DOGE Subcommittee tomorrow on Capitol Hill. Cue Big Bird. We'll have more next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
Would you be interested in defunding and taking away taxpayer dollars to NPR and PBS?
Well, I would love to do that. I think it's very unfair. It's been very biased with the whole group. I mean, the whole group of them. And frankly, there's plenty. Look at all the media you have right now. There's plenty of coverage. I was from a different age.
President Trump in the Oval Office earlier today on the future of NPR and PBS. I think it was in the cabinet room there, actually. Tomorrow, leaders of the partially publicly funded media organizations, public broadcasting, will testify before the DOGE Subcommittee. This is something we've heard a lot about over the years, Kaylee, remembering Mitt Romney singling out Big Bird as a place to cut, but it doesn't bring too much savings to the government. We'll see how they do tomorrow.
Yeah, of course, before the subcommittee that's led by Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene always promises that there could be some fireworks involved. And we also have a programming note for you. Make sure to tune in to our colleague David Gura's exclusive sit-down interview with Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren. That's tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time as part of the Big Take podcast. And we'll be back tomorrow as well on Bloomberg TV and radio.